Here's another little bonus for you guys here. Today, we're going to address Roger Bacon and his compendium. After this, we're going to look at the condemnation of 1277 and the fallout as a result of it, and this sort of shift in philosophy that takes place in 1277, and what pieces get to be picked up and moved along.
In the compendium, we see Bacon's criticism of everybody around him. And this is largely done in his idea to pursue true philosophy. But as such, he's going to lay out his sort of problems with everybody around him. He states, "For these hindrances bring it about that men believe themselves to stand in the highest glory of wisdom, so that there was never so great an appearance of wisdom, nor so busy exercise of study in so many branches in so many parts of the world of the last 40 years." But this is a great backhanded compliment, right? He's saying that we've studied more in the last 40 years on philosophy than at any other point. But this is really the appearance of wisdom and busy exercise of study. We're working really hard, but not doing any real work. And here he's really speaking out against both the Dominicans and the Franciscans, of which he is a member. And in the next sentence after this, he calls them the two student orders, which we can take in the way that, yes, these are the ones producing students at the University of Paris and elsewhere, but also, okay, you're not really masters. You're just students. You're fledglings. You think you know more than you do. Right? You're the freshman college student who took one class and now understands the entire world and go back and criticize your parents for not knowing anything. In reality, you have a lot more to learn and give it a little more time. What you just learned might be right or it might be full of it, and you might want to, temper your criticisms. And this is the same sort of argument that we might say even against Bacon. He says, "For more sins reign in these days than in any past age, and sin is incompatible with wisdom." So he's going to then go off and give a list of sins that follows. He says, "For the court of Rome, which once was ruled by God's wisdom, should always be so ruled, is now debased by the constitutions of lay emperors, made for the governance of lay folk and contained in the code of civil law." Right? There's too much law moving into the papacy here, saying that the Pope is too much a king or a governor or an emperor, and not enough of a spiritual leader of the people. Now let us see the prelates, how they run after money, neglect the cure of souls, promote their nephews and other carnal friends, and crafty lawyers who ruin all by their counsels. For they despise students in philosophy and theology, and hinder the two orders who come forward to serve the Lord without hire, from the living in freedom and working on the salvation of souls. So even those who are serving the Pope are not doing well. Now, what of the religious orders? I exclude none of them from what I say, Bacon states. And the new orders of the friars are already horribly decayed from the first dignity. The whole clergy is intent upon pride, lechery, and avarice, and wherever clerics are gathered together, as at Paris and in Oxford, they scandalize the whole laity with their wars and quarrels and other vices. So even the religious orders of which he's a part of said they started off great, but now they're just corrupting everybody. And remember, this is very early on in the career of these orders that he's saying they've kind of failed entirely. The princes and barons and knights oppress and rob one another, so they're not going to be escaped from his wrath either. And he says the people, harassed by the princes, hate them and keep no fealty save under compulsion. So even the people themselves, the only reason why they would love their king is that they feel afraid of them. He states, "We eat and drink him, Christ, and turn him and become gods and Christ. Certainly, if men had faith, reverence, and devotion to this sacrament, as they are said and duty bound, then they would not corrupt themselves with so many errors and sins and wickedness. There's too much sin. How is it that you consume Christ and yet you don't realize the sanctity that you're called to?" And so this is a nice, interesting look into Bacon himself. He's wanting true repentance to some stripe. He's calling for people to seek after God. But again, this becomes a little tricky with the way things work. The third consideration from effects, he says, is taken by comparing our state with that of ancient philosophers, who, though they were without the quickening grace which makes man worthy of eternal life, and where you are entered into baptism, yet lived beyond all comparison better than we, both in all decency and contempt of the world, with its delights and riches and honors, and all men read the works of Aristotle, Seneca, Tully, in Cicero, Avicenna, Alpharabus, Plato, Socrates, and others. And so it was they who attained the secrets of wisdom and found out all knowledge. But we Christians have discovered nothing worthy of those philosophers, nor can we even understand their wisdom, which ignorance of our springs from this cause, that our morals are worse than theirs. Right? So again, this is very strict and horrible criticism. He says these ancient philosophers were better than us, and yet they didn't have baptism, they didn't have these sanctifying effects, and yet their lives were better. Now, there's some of this is romanticism of the past. Some of this is just kind of holding up a mirror to criticize others, and in many ways it might even be a funhouse mirror. He doesn't actually know how these people really lived. He wasn't there. He's just reading their words and their texts and what their ideals are to be. But he's placing this and says, if this is their ideals, we should also try to do so. So this is where he's going to be moving on at this point. So at this point, Bacon is going to begin to call for something. He says, wherefore wickedness must needs be uprooted, and the elect of God must appear, or else one most blessed Pope will come, who shall remove all corruptions from the university and church, and everywhere that the world may be renewed, and the fullness of the Gentiles may enter in, and the remnants of Israel be converted to the faith. Bacon here is really calling for something akin to the condemnation of 1277, but in a larger scope, and obviously one that would not include him. But the idea is we need to look at things not from looking at Aristotle as the bad guy, but the corruption that exists for everybody else. He's wanting a call for condemnation of those who will call for the condemnation, as it were. He says the second principal cause of error in the present pursuit of wisdom is this: that for 40 years past, certain men have arisen in the universities who have created themselves masters and doctors in theology and philosophy, though they themselves have never learned anything of any account, nor will they, or can they learn by reason of their position. These are boys of two student orders, as Albert and Thomas and others, who in many cases enter those orders at or below the age of 20 years. Here he's specifically calling out Albert and Thomas for becoming masters without being students. He says, you didn't learn from anybody, right? We saw this with our discussion of Albert, that Bacon will criticize him for just kind of being self-taught. And he's also criticizing Thomas for entering the order and studies too young. Oddly enough, Bacon also entered too young, but he's kind of pushing this back and saying, you know, others have failed in this way as well. He says, many thousands become friars who cannot read their Psalter or their donate, yet they, as they are 10 years old, immediately after their admission are then sent off to study theology. Right? He's calling here for something like a primary school, that you're not going to get a 10-year-old sent off to the university, but maybe they need to be sent off somewhere else. We will actually see in our next section, of course, when we're going to talk about Gerhard Grote and the creation of the Brotherhood of the Common Life in the Northern Renaissance near the end, that what Bacon is actually calling for here will come to fruition, that we kind of get the divisions of grades and the formation of kind of what we would think of as primary education. And so Bacon says that this is desperately needed, that we get 10-year-olds who become start studying to become masters of theology. And he's like, you can't even read yet. You're ignorant of everything of the world. This is not where you should be. Uh, he says, if I had the power over the books of Aristotle, as at present translated, I would burn them all. For the study therein is but lost in time and a source of error and the multiplication of ignorance beyond all human power to describe. And seeing that the labors of Aristotle are now the foundation of all wisdom, therefore no man may tell how much the Latins waste now because they have accepted evil translations of the philosopher. Right? This is why he's going to burn them all, because the translations are bad. And so he's criticizing these translations once again. The problem is not Aristotle, but the translations of Aristotle, largely because of the Islamic influence, likely, of the translation. He says Albert, we would see is doing a good job, but Bacon doesn't want to concede Albert's translations because he doesn't really like Albert, because he doesn't really like anybody. And he also doesn't like that Albert wasn't formally educated. He doesn't have the right family connections. And we might see a little bit of Bacon as being the spoiled rich kid with the old money who doesn't like the nouveau riche, the new wealthy, the newly educated showing up. So this might be part of his criticism. Moreover, he says, the Latins lack innumerable books of the Hebrew and Greek exporters, as Origen and Basil, Gregory Nazarene, Damascus Nicene, Dionysius, Chrysostom, and the most notable doctors of the Hebrew as well as the Greek. Therefore the church slumbers, for in this matter she does nothing, nor has done these 70 past years, except that the Lord Robert Grossetti, of holy memory, Bishop of Lincoln, translated into Latin from the books of St. Dionysius and Damascus, and a few other consecrated teachers. So he does, while he criticizes Grossetti a few times in his life, he does here also hold on that, at the end in this compendium, he did a good job, at least with Damascus and Dionysius. Concluding, he will state, for thus, by examples already cited, we may set forth clearly enough by way of compendious introduction to see general terms how the Bible has been corrupted. And we would say this corruption has applied to everybody. And he's not saying that the text of the Bible is corrupted, but rather its applications are corrupted because people are not reading it right. So this is sort of Bacon's list at the end of his life of everyone who he thinks kind of all suck. And we need a massive reform of the educational system, and the orders he thinks are not helping this, that they're on the wrong side of this educational shift that needs to occur. In the 60s, we get all sorts of trouble here, right? We get troubles with Aristotle throughout the 60s, the 1260s. And the greatest challenger to everything, the biggest rabble-rouser, is Sigurd de Brabant, whose very short life, 1240 to 1283, will find himself in all sorts of issues and the height of all sorts of controversies. As a young scholar, he ends up procuring Aristotelian texts, and he ends up propagating Aristotle to others at the University of Paris. He's in his 20s throughout this time, and he's just kind of excited to get Aristotle and the new kind of ideas out there. And he's really kind of the rather popular leader of an unorthodox group of Aristotelians. He's bringing in contraband material, and he's at the university trying to shut the whole thing down. And, he's this crazy, hippie radical, as we were, in many different ways. And he's kind of got a little bit of freedom to do so because the real authorities on Aristotle at this time are not at the University of Paris. Albert the Great, in his translation, is off to Cologne throughout this time, right? He left in 1248. Aquinas is in Italy throughout most of this time. Bonaventure is the Minister General of the Friars, and so while Bonaventure is going to spend most of his time administering the friars, he's only going to kind of check in with the university and people who are there from time to time. And so what we get is that Sigurd can kind of do whatever he wants throughout the 1260s. and he can kind of take ideas a little too far. He doesn't have good oversight. He doesn't have a good teacher. And so he's going to end up just reading from the Aristotle that he's got, which is really not Aristotle, but is Averroes. And so what we end up getting is really not just the trouble with Aristotle, but Aristotle with Averroes' stamp. And this is going to really kind of begin in the 1266-ish to 1269 era. And he's going to support the idea that the world was eternal as held by Aristotle, that the soul is mortal, that the intellect was unique to mankind, and denying any sort of future life for human individuals, and a remover of moral responsibility as well. There is no heaven. There's no eternal life because your soul will die. There is no lasting impact, right? You're going to live for the moment. You're going to live for now because there's nothing else. Also, the intellect that you have is not singular to you, but following Averroes, we get the idea of the agent intellect that is singular to all of humanity and common. Right? And this is kind of leading towards that notion of monopsychism, that there is a single soul or spirit for all of humanity. This is following very much with Averroes and is going to be kind of supported by Seeger. And he's going to start to get some pushback in the late 1260s. Bonaventure will kind of check in and criticize the use, especially during Lent, of pagan philosophy, primarily that more of the Arabs than just of Aristotle, as we've already kind of seen. Bonaventure uses Aristotle more than anyone else, other than Albert and Aquinas at this point, and maybe even Bacon, but he's in that top echelon of those who use that. In 1269, Aquinas will return to the University of Paris, as we mentioned before, and he criticizes Seeger's doctrines. Aquinas also had to defend himself against John Petcham, the conservative regent of the Franciscans at this time, which included 2 public disputations on the unity of form of man. Aquinas was pro, but with notions of accidents. And so Aquinas is here criticizing the radical Aristotelians, and then also having to support and himself on the other end of saying, but not all use of Aristotle is bad. Those people are bad. They've gone too far. You need to come to my end. But then, of course, Aquinas leaves in 1272, so many of the errors of Seeger start to kind of creep back, even though he kind of renounced them on the larger extreme. Seeger is not alone with these criticisms and misinterpretations of Aristotle. He's kind of got an ally with Boethius of Dacia, or Sweden, who denied the belief of the universe that it had a beginning. He thought that the universe was eternal in this end. And so we kind of get other people who are going to kind of throw out their interpretations of Aristotle or Greek philosophy that is also kind of too crazy. And what we see is starting at the universities in the 1960s and the 1260s. Right, we see some big parallels here where things are going too crazy, where people are becoming radicalized in the mid 60s, and we're going to probably get a large hippie music festival outside of Paris at some point, right, or something along those lines, where everyone is just moving things too far, and this is going to lead to the condemnations that will begin in the 1270s and sort of kind of the pushing back. We're going to elect a Nixon sort of character to be in charge. So as we've seen already, the 60s were definitely going to lead to something. And so the condemnation that will come in the 1270s kind of grows from many different sources and for a lot of different reasons, actually. At the heart of it is the bishops who are going to condemn a list of propositions that they believe were detrimental to the Christian life. This is natural. The bishops are supposed to oversee everything, and they start to see the craziness, and they say, okay, we need to stop the craziness at the universities. We need to stop all of the craziness that exists everywhere. The more conservative voices in this debate were the Franciscans. Although the more radical voice were also the Franciscans. The friars really become a bothersome affair for most of these larger dioceses, Paris being the most important of which, but we'll see the same sort of issues in England and elsewhere as well. The real victor actually is going to be Aquinas. Traditionally, the condemnation of 1277 and those of 1270 are viewed as kind of a conservative Franciscan resistance to Thomism. But in many ways, it's actually the bishops who are pushing back against the friars of both types. There's a problem here that the friars are answerable only to the Pope and not to local bishops. And this is a struggle, which today we understand the hierarchy, the Pope being very much in charge of everything. But a lot of your local bishops didn't always agree. As we've seen throughout this era, we've already kind of gotten a division between local bishops and popes and anti-popes and new popes, and before too long we'll get the Avignon papacy and the Western Schism, and the Pope is really not as in charge as he wants to be, and the local bishops like to see themselves as essentially the ones in charge of a region, and occasionally they'll check with the Pope just to make sure that they don't get too far out of line, but they really don't want anyone going above their head, as it were. And the issue is that the Pope could really use the orders to circumvent regional authority. And this is especially an issue in France, where the princes could appoint bishops without the Pope's consent. This is an issue known as lay investiture. The rest of Europe, this is not okay, but in France, it long-standingly has been okay. And so oftentimes you'll end up getting a bishop in France who doesn't care what the Pope says. The Pope doesn't get to decide if they're there, and they're much more French than they are Catholic sometimes, and this becomes all sorts of an issue. So here the issue for the local bishops, especially in France, is that the friars could potentially interfere with domestic politics in many different countries without local bishops knowing or accepting what they're doing. You get the interesting sort of position where the friars can push back and kind of circumvent local authority. In many ways, you'll actually see this with monastic orders later on in what becomes known as the 30 Years' War, that the Jesuits are to blame. Whether or not they are or not is a larger issue for historical debate, but the traditional sort of trope is that the Jesuits kind of masterminded at least portions of the 30 Years' War, kind of circumventing local authority, and that's the sort of fear that exists for the local bishops, especially when they are related to princes and dukes and whatnot in France, that the friars might be doing at this point. The Pope then had to try to appease the local bishops and princes while maintaining control of the monastic orders, especially the friars who are not out, but in cities, right? This, again, puts the Pope in a very difficult sort of position. Not sure how to respond to all of this craziness. Additionally, the friars had enemies amongst the secular clergy, right? The priests who are not monastics are the secular clergy, who believe that the monks took from them the benefices and rents and the offerings that would be given by the people. A lot of times are going to the monastics who are begging for it, literally, right? That's what the mendicants are doing. And they're also undermining their roles as confessors and administrators of sacraments. So you get a lot of questions of, what's the role of the monastics in these cities, right? When they used to kind of be out, as you saw in the East in the Desert Fathers and others, right? When the monastics were always far away, that's one thing. But now you're getting these large networks throughout the early to middle of the Middle Ages here, where you're getting networks right outside of towns and then in towns. and then people begging, right? It's shifting the whole economic, social relationships that exist. You're not getting the same sort of requests for confessions from your local priests the way that you should, and really there is just a logistical headache that's happening with the influx of these monastics, especially into the larger cities where these universities are, where they're also starting to entertain some more radical ideas. We even have an example of this in 1251 when William of Saint Amour attacked the friars' right to exist at all and addressed them as the Antichrist, right? He convinced Pope Innocent IV to issue the bull Asti Numerium in 1254, where the freedom to preach and to hear confessions were restricted to the secular clergy, right? Innocent, by the way, died a few weeks later, and the friars will end up saying that this was divine judgment against him, and this is overturned by Alexander IV, who becomes the next pope. But you see this sort of tension that exists, and of course, the radicals, the ones who are really the problem, are not the Franciscans because they're the conservatives with a couple of radical voices on the extreme, but they can kind of hold it within that order. The real radicals that need to be overturned are the Dominicans, right? They're the troublemakers. And of course, here you see my nice alma mater there of the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology, where I studied amongst Dominicans as well. But they're often engaged in disputes over the privilege of the monastics over the lay clergy in the vocation of preaching and teaching, right? The main preachers at this time, a lot of your local clergy aren't doing it. It really is on the shoulders of the Dominicans to give sermons. And so they're speaking to people and people are listening to them. And of course, this makes them really bad from everyone else's sort of position, right? When the civil authorities come to a dispute within the university, everyone is simply told to quit lecturing, and the Dominicans don't care. They're going to keep lecturing. This is what they're called to do, and this is what they're continuing to do. They also refused to swear an oath to the university. Thus, they were kicked out of the University of Paris in 1235. They appealed to the Pope and were readmitted the next year. Right? We already kind of encountered this a little bit when Bonaventure and Thomas were both delayed in getting their masters during this sort of interim period as a result. French Dominicans really tried to minimize speculation. In 1271, Montpellier chapter suggests that they should not devote time to natural sciences. In the chapter on Buddha, the Dominicans should give up all books on alchemy or natural sciences. So, right, they're kind of the radicals and the troublemakers in an extra sort of way. The Franciscans also said that they were better than the Dominicans because they had higher poverty and would try to lure away Dominicans to become Franciscans whenever they could. The Dominicans were the rock stars, but the real rebels, the troublemakers, who do so within still the confines of the church and through wanting to teach and preach appropriately, are the Dominicans. So this is the heart, right? This is the heart of the controversy as well. We get issues of authority, we get people overlapping others, we get friars on friars issue, we get a whole host of problems that need to get solved in some way. And really the best way would probably be a general church council that spells things out. But the problem with calling for a council is this also calls for issues of authority. If the Pope doesn't actually want to call this, then they could lose their authority and their right to the cardinals who are there and the bishops who are there to discuss these issues. So, and the bishops don't want to try to call it and circumvent the Pope. That's going to get them in trouble. And even though we just had the Council of Lyon, this should have been something that was kind of being addressed at this point, but wasn't. So, right, we get, because it's a tricky sort of muddy position that everyone finds themselves in. So where we actually get the condemnation, where this comes about, and why it actually is applied is in the idea of philosophy. This becomes the sort of lever that could be used to stamp down some of the craziness of thought, because after all, this is the heart of Sigurd Brabat and others who are kind of throwing out these more crazy ideas. And so the first sort of way to fix all of this is to oppose Aristotle and go back to the more conservative approach to philosophy that works best with Christian revelation, that of this sort of Neoplatonic interpretation. And so there becomes this sort of push to go, all right, you guys have gone too far, let's just abandon Aristotle entirely. The French and English resistance also to any sort of speculative philosophy. German, though it lacked schools, right, except for Cologne, didn't have any sort of real resistance to Aristotle, and Italy was far more concerned with law and governance issues. So it makes sense that we're going to find this sort of philosophical condemnations in Paris and also in Oxford. Two philosophers will actually join in with this. Roger Bacon, who really didn't like the popularity of Aquinas, nor the scientific treatment of Albert, kind of throws his hat into the ring of kind of condemning this, although not in this formal sort of sense. We also get Henry of Ghent, who will actually write the condemnation. He's an Augustinian, but is a sympathetic reader of Avicenna. He defines being as everything that is, for instance. So we're going to kind of get this weird sort of position where he's not entirely and against all Aristotle, but he thinks that it's gone too far. Henry of Ghent argues that there are two kinds of being. We have uncreated, which is God, and created, which is everything else. At heart, he is a Platonist in the sense that he would accept Anselm's ontological argument, right, that there is no distinction between being and its essence. So he's going to be in that sort of vein. And he held that truth has a reality apart from sensation. Aquinas would hold that nothing is in the intellect that does not first come through the senses. So we do have this division that exists between them. And then we're going to get kind of like 2.5-ish bishops who are also going to launch the sort of condemnations as well. Most important in England is Robert Kilwarby, 1215 to 1279, who's a Dominican who left Oxford and becomes the Bishop of Canterbury. Kilwarby uses Arabic philosophy and holds a similar idea to that of Bacon. He says, quote, "There are two types of memory. There is the one type that arises from the species and the first received to our intellect and then gathered in our memory. Now this is the memory characteristic of the possible intellect, which comes after understanding and will, since that which I first understood and then love I preserve in my memory. There is another type of memory which is a habit of all the intelligible forms that exist, at least in angelic minds and in their very nature. In us, this type of memory is the memory of the agent intellect, right? So we can kind of see some use of Arabic philosophy there as well, right? We see the notion of the agent intellect addressed by Averroes, yet these ideas that Kilwarby rejects in his condemnation, right? He's going to reject this same sort of ideas while he's rejecting everything because he sees that it's gone too far. John Pencham, 1230 to 1292, is going to become the next Archbishop of Canterbury after Kilwarby, and he's our half bishop that's going to also condemn these things. In 1269, he wanted to get Thomas flustered in the dispute of Paris, as we've already addressed. He lost this. Aquinas won. He becomes regent of the Franciscans in 1269, archbishop in 1279, and Pencham will continue to try to get Aquinas condemned even after 1277. In 1286, he's pronounced a judgment against Thomist propositions, including the notion of the unity of form. Right, we saw this earlier. Fight was over this very issue in Paris. He now identifies this idea as a heresy, not just as an error. He also tries to excommunicate and shun any Thomists in England. This is overturned by the Pope at the request of the Dominicans, and Pencham died, it said, going insane. He really kind of spends most of his life trying to get rid of Thomism, and he's kind of the chief enemy, Franciscan enemy of the Dominicans, as it were. Our biggest enemy, though, the man who calls for this condemnation is Stephen Tempier, the Archbishop of Paris. He never really liked the school. He really didn't like all of the monastics joining it, and he was encouraged by Petrem to include Aquinas in his distrust of other Aristotelians. Tempier forbade the university faculty to discuss theological questions in April of 1276. And what we get is really a plot between Kilwardby and Tempier, who try to equate Aquinas with Sigurd of Brabant, and says that they're really kind of the same person, even though they're really not, and that the whole system of this Aristotelian ideas need to go away. And so they're going to all be condemned. The main issue is dealing with Aquinas and the idea of the unicity of forms. For many, it was not just the use of Aristotle or the extreme Averroism of Singer, but also just this whole doctrine, right? So this becomes the huge issue that is talked about here in the Summa. As St. Thomas notes, a substantial form does not have being in itself independent of that which it is to be united. So neither does the matter to which it is joined. From their union results that being in which the reality subsists in itself, and from them is produced something essentially one. This is seen as Aquinas on Being and Essence in the Summa 1, question 76, article 1. Right? The other view follows Plato, that the body is the form of the spirit, rather than the body with the soul as a unified form. Right? So if the body, and this becomes this sort of issue of what is man and how should this be looked at, and Aquinas is seen as too far, and this is why it's going to be condemned. It's pushed back against, and this becomes the heart of the issue, other than just, okay, obviously Siger is crazy, and he's gone too far, and that's easy to condemn. But the heart of the issue comes down to this, is what is the form of man? Is man one, or is man two? And this doesn't mean like a split where you've got two minds, but is your body the form of your soul, or is it all some sort of commingling singularity, as Aquinas would advocate? What we really see at the heart of the Paris condemnation of 1277 is discussing and the person and the work of St. Thomas Aquinas. The anniversary of Aquinas' death is actually selected as the date for the condemnation of him. Right? This is really the heart of it. It's picking 3 years after his death to go ahead and take him out, and to have him not be regarded as the saint that he will be known as, or as a doctor of the church or anything else. The main thrust is against Aquinas overall, but there are the easier fruit, the low-hanging fruit of Siger becomes the real sort of easy way to address this. All right, you can't quite take on Aquinas directly, so you're going to pick the abuses of Siger, of Brabant, the use of Avicenna and Averroes, and their interpretations of Aristotle. And so you're going to use Siger and Boethius of Dacia that we mentioned before as the easy people to kind of condemn. The criticism was partly against the doctrines of double truth and any ideas which seem to limit the freedom of God. And this becomes also wrapped into this. The condemnation ended Sigur's career. He appealed to Rome, was acquitted of heresy by Nicholas III, but was then placed under house arrest in the Vatican until he was then murdered in 1284 by his own demented secretary. Attitudes towards him are really kind of mixed, and he was likely viewed as the proper repentant philosopher who accepted the condemnation of his errors and his own punishment, this being under house arrest there. He is actually listed by Dante as being in paradise near Dionysius and the Venerable Bede and Richard of St. Victor. So, right, he's condemned, his ideas are condemned, but he recants. He says, okay, here's where I'm wrong, I'll accept it, and then I'll just kind of live out the rest of my life in house arrest until I get murdered. Right? He's even called the Great by a fellow philosopher, which again is fairly rare. Albert gets it, and nobody else at this time gets the Great. So that anyone would kind of throw this out there is kind of interesting. But so we have this weird sort of relationship with him. Henry of Ghent also is involved with, right? He argued that Aquinas was close to being a polytheist in his conception of the intelligence of angels. As early as 1269, he argued that Aquinas was wrong and contrary to the faith, and he becomes one of the big pushers to try to get this whole thing going. Obviously, this wouldn't sit very well with Aquinas. He's since been dead for 3 years. And so what we're going to get is Albert and Albert's reply. Albert said that he would defend Aquinas' work before a jury of competent men. And so he journeys to Paris to defend him. One account, though probably somewhat fictionalized, says that Albert showed up to Paris on March 7th of 1277 on the eve of the condemnation and demanded the bishop to retract his accusations against Thomas. The 219 theses were not as strong against Aquinas in Paris as they were in London. Aquinas' name is not specifically mentioned in Paris, though many of his ideas, unicity of forms and others, were. Albert then returned to Cologne and went over the Summa to defend it against any accusations. Largely, Albert had some time to work on this in reality. This was not I raced there and I stopped it at the very last moment and said, retract the name of Aquinas, but rather probably his influence kind of helped minimize how that was going to be done. So we do have a very important role that Albert has within this. While looking at the Summa and defending it, Albert, the teacher of Aquinas, is also then referred to at this point Thomas, the savior of the Catholic head and of the heart. And really, the teacher of Aquinas becomes a student of Aquinas of their own Summa. Not to minimize Albert here, I think a lot of times people do that, but he ends up becoming a really big supporter of this work and marveling in some ways about what his student did in taking these ideas. In reality, Albert succeeded because John the Pope, John 21st, died, and the cardinals who met to elect a new pope forbade Tempier to proceed any further than he did. Right, so we end up getting this sort of bishops all coming together and say, all right, you guys slow down. So the condemnation was really a private one and a smaller one. The condemnation will last, though, until Pope Martin IV dies in 1285. Since he was a follower of Tempier, we're not going to remove this condemnation as well in Paris. The condemnation of 1277 actually lists 219 propositions. It states, some students of the arts of Paris are exceeding the boundaries of their own faculty and are presuming to treat and discuss certain obvious and loathsome errors, or rather vanities and lying follies. They conceal their answers in such a way that while wishing to avoid Scylla, they fall into Chartist. For they say that these things are true according to philosophy, but not according to the Catholic faith, as if they were two contrary truths, as if the truth of the sacred scripture were contained in the truth and the sayings of the accursed pagans, inasmuch as true wisdom destroys false wisdom. Right, we see this sort of discussion here between faith and reason, between philosophical speculation and revealed revelation. And here the condemnation opens up saying that they have to be one and the same. One cannot be condemned and the other one upheld. It states, we excommunicate all those who shall have taught and said errors or any of them, or shall have dared in any way to defend or uphold them, or even to listen to them, unless they choose to reveal themselves to us in the Chancery of Paris within 7 days. So you've got 7 days to be able to come here and face the condemnation. Turning our attention now to the actual articles, these are any proposition that is held by this is getting the sentence of excommunication. These are the specific charges that are being brought against. The first is that there is no more excellent state than to study philosophy. This is where it's going to be opened up, right? The argument made by many is that studying philosophy is the most excellent state, and this is going to be condemned at the very outset from this the condemnation of 1277 out of Paris, because after all, theology is the higher art than philosophy. To study and to know God, to live a penitent life, is the more excellent state. That philosophy is not that. But yet, we've kind of seen this sort of discussion about philosophy being the highest state, especially when we're discussing, Arabic philosophy in many different ways as well, bringing us naturally to number 2, which states that only wise men in the world are the philosophers. Al-Farabi and others held this idea, and of course this is going to be condemned, saying that indeed there can be those who are wise that are not philosophers. Number 9 is that we can know God by his essence in this mortal life. The idea that you can actually know God in God's essence is being condemned as well. This is not an argument that Aquinas would hold either. Aquinas and many others would end up holding the idea that you're going to know God through God's created graces. So the idea that you can actually know God in God's essence is a general condemnation that many would go ahead and accept, even Aquinas as well. Moving on to 10, that nothing can be known about God except that he is, or that God exists. This idea is going to also be condemned, saying that things can be known about God beyond just the existence of God. This becomes the pure philosophical speculation that says the only thing that can be affirmed about God is that God exists. And rather, no, they're going to say other things can be revealed, that there is a place for revelation as well, that philosophical speculation and the purist art and this sort of agnostic sort of speculation is not going to be the only thing anyone could know, but you have revelation as well. 13, that God does not know things other than himself. We saw this a lot with Avicenna and Averroes as well, right? That God only knows God's self through contemplation, and then you get the emanations of the spheres that end up kind of growing out of this sort of God knowing God's self, and then this creates the second sphere that then reflects upon itself and reflects, and this creates the third, and so on and so forth. And this idea is being condemned as well. So this Averroesism is going to be kind of kicked out, right? This is not going to be held and supported. Number 24, that God is eternal in acting and moving, just as he is eternal in existing. Otherwise, he would be determined by some other thing that would be prior to him. Here we have the debate between our Arabic philosophers on whether God is moving or unmoving, because moving connotes change, therefore is God unmoving, right? So this whole argument is just condemned, pushed out, and rejected on its face. 83 states that the world, although it was made from nothing, was not newly made. And although it passed from non-being to being, and non-being did not precede being in duration, but only in nature, right? What's being condemned here is the interpretation of Aristotle's eternal universe coming into being at the same time as time came into being. And so this idea is also being condemned. So this is kind of the way that a lot of people were trying to hold God created the universe out of nothing, and Aristotle's notion that the universe is eternal, one and the same, and this argument is going to be condemned as well. 86 states that eternity and time have no existence in reality, but only in the mind. This notion is also condemned. It continues, condemnation at number 91 states that there has already been infinite number of revolutions of the heaven, of which is possible for the created intellect, but not for the first cause to comprehend. This is an idea that was held by Stoics and affirmed by many different ancient philosophies. Here, that God is the creative fire, spawns various things in cycles, and they gradually separate into the four elements: water, fire, not earthly fire, not divine fire, air, and earth. Eventually, they will reduce back to the flame that then expanded the universe again to another cycle, and each cycle is identical to the one that went before it. This is the sort of Stoic notion of how creation and the universe exists in an all sorts of eternal way. And while this works really well at explaining deja vu, it really gets rid of any notion of freedom, and is also going to be condemned at this point. So we're seeing with the condemnation not just Aristotle or Aristotelian ideas, but a whole host of just other speculative philosophy, borrowing from Stoics, borrowing from the Arabs and others, that are all just kind of being condemned as well. 102 states that nothing happens by chance, but everything comes about by necessity, and that all things that will exist in the future will exist by necessity. Al-Ghazi, right, argued this idea, and therefore there was no free will. This is going to be condemned because free will is going to be affirmed. 154, that our will is subject to the power of the heavenly bodies. Avicenna holds this, and this is being condemned as well. That there can be no sin in the higher power of the soul, and the sin comes from the passion and not from the will. Now, this is interesting that it's being condemned. There's a nice sort of discussion between the relation of the passions, as we talked about with Maximus the Confessor, and its relation to the will. And we're going to hold the Maximus's right that the will is going to be able to sin as well, and that the passion itself becomes what might drive one to sin, but it's not itself sinful. So this argument is going to be condemned, and Maximus will be affirmed in this point. 169a states that as long as passion and particular science are present in act, the will cannot go against them. Same discussion as just mentioned a moment ago. And 216 states that a philosopher must not concede the resurrection to come because it cannot be investigated by reason. Here, speculation in general about the future of providence was a questionable thing for many to treat as a subject of philosophy, and the condemnation says you can't state that because you can't know it, that it can't be looked at or discussed, because after all, it's affirmed and known through revelation, and revelation can be here. So what we've seen here is kind of just a taste of the condemnations of the 219 different propositions, highlighting a few of them and how they relate to kind of the more controversial notions of philosophy that were existing in Paris in the late 13th century. The condemnation of Paris is in many ways somewhat measured compared to what we will actually see in the English condemnation. In Oxford and English, Aquinas is condemned on March 18th, 1277. Not his name still, but the thesis primarily of unicity of forms is really brought forward at this point. On October 29th of 1284, Kilwarby's condemnation of 1277 is renewed by John Pensham, the next Archbishop of Canterbury. And in 1286, England condemns Napwell, a Dominican follower of Aquinas, as a heretic, and he gets condemned to perpetual silence. England really pushes hard at continuing the gas at condemning Aquinas, while Paris kind of slowly recants or lifts the condemnations. We don't get that in England until it really is forced to happen. We get a slow lifting of the condemnations first in Paris, and then it just has to become universally accepted. The Dominicans really fell in line and sent reps to England to try to rehabilitate Aquinas and to force a retraction from Dominicans who were opposed to Thomas there. In part, this is due to the work of Albert the Great and his influence throughout this time. The condemnation of 1277 slowly made Aquinas' work the official belief system of the Dominican order, though, changing the course of the order of the preachers, right? So we end up getting this sort of solidification of the Dominicans around Aquinas, because you've now picked on one of our own. And while many of us might not have held that the Summa is the most important thing, we now have to defend that the Summa is the most important thing. You see the same basic idea here within politics and everything else. You might not like somebody, but when they're getting beat up on, they're getting picked up too much, and they're kind of on your side, you become a little bit more militant in defending them. And that's the same basic issue that's happening here with the condemnation of 1277. When Pope Martin dies, Honorius IV is elected in 1285, and we get a recantation of Honorius sends out the condemnation of Aquinas back to the University of Paris to look it over again. You need to see what it's wrong. And the masters there decide that Aquinas was merely wrong and not contrary to the faith. Honorius IV dies in 1286, and Nicholas IV is elected as the next pope. He's a conservative Franciscan and a former Minister General of the Order, and he sides with Pencham and criticizes and critiques Thomism in England as well. So we end up getting this kind of double reflection here as well. This causes the Dominicans to see Pencham then as the arch enemy of the order and commands all in the order to do everything in their power to defend Thomas's doctrine as legitimate, making the order one that backs Thomas. This becomes the important thing here. Now again, remember, not everyone agreed with Thomas's position, but it becomes the official cause for the Dominicans who felt persecuted to stand up against. Same sort of idea that we were just talking about before. In 1309, Thomas then becomes named the official doctrine of the Dominicans, binding all lectors throughout the order to follow the teachings of Aquinas. This is then repeated again in 1313, 1314, and 1315, in case they didn't quite get the note in 1309. In fact, the condemnation against Aquinas was not lifted in Paris until 1235, 2 years after he was canonized. Right, so the Dominicans are really pushing hard and fighting about it, and they're getting, okay, you're just merely wrong, you're not a heretic. Okay, let's not really kind of suppress you anymore. The Dominicans are fighting about it. Thomas will get, was canonized a saint, and 2 years later, like, okay, let's go ahead and lift the condemnation against him. Although what's stated is it's not an entire lifting of the condemnation. The quote is, only insofar as they touch or are asserted to touch the teaching of the aforementioned Blessed Thomas. Right, so we're not really lifting the condemnation. We're just saying, okay, the things that actually talked about Aquinas are not quite being condemned, but otherwise we're condemning everything still. It really also creates a division between the friars minor and the friars preacher, right? The Dominicans and the Franciscans are now really at loggerheads and are not going to be quite as harmonious throughout the remaining part of the century or the beginning of the next. And really, we kind of have to look at philosophy again after Thomas and after the condemnation of 1277. Some questions need to be looked at. Was his or other notions of anthropology correct? How should we see people? How many parts are we going to hold that you are one, or are we going to hold with a division of parts? Is Aquinas a really useful philosopher in addressing this, or should we not look at this? How about notions of metaphysics, right? Can we accept Thomas's understanding, or should we not? Was Aristotle himself victorious in his application and his use through Aquinas or not? These are all sorts of questions that really you should be left at the end of this section before moving on to the next one. The ideas of scholasticism at its high point are starting to all fall apart with this condemnation. And we're going to see kind of the last sort of reactions and critiques and revisions of medieval philosophy going from this point forward. But we've kind of hit this high point with Aquinas and are starting to see how things are falling apart through internal dissension with people like Bacon and the condemnations of Paris as well. So how should we see things at this point? Should be part of what you're thinking about going forward.
As you can see, philosophy can sometimes be a contact sport. There's a lot involved with trying to figure out which way philosophy is going to go. What ideas and sort of starting points are going to be the ones that I've got greatest value. And oftentimes when you start to have a shift in thought, there's a lot of fallout involved with that. How do you wrestle with Aristotle? Do you accept him? Do you reject him? How do you accept the interpretation that others had of Aristotle? Do you accept or reject those? And how do you move with all of this going forward? So again, philosophy can sometimes be a contact sport. Bacon knew that, as well as many others.